In the autumn of 1934, an anthropologist named Fay-Cooper Cole climbed a low ridge above Avery Lake in Massac County, Illinois, at the southern tip of the state where the land narrows toward the Ohio River. He was standing in farmland. Cotton and corn stretched across the bottoms toward the towns of Brookport and Hamletsburg, and the mounds themselves, the reason he had come, rose out of the fields as low grassy hills that generations of farmers had ploughed around without much comment. They were not a discovery in the sense the word usually carries. People who worked this ground had known for as long as anyone could remember that the rises were too regular, too flat on top, arranged in a pattern no flood or glacier would have produced. What nobody standing there in 1934 could yet say was what the pattern was arranged around, how many people had built it, or when the builders had stopped. Cole had come from the University of Chicago with a mandate shaped less by scholarship than by economics. The country was 4 years into the worst depression in its history, and one of the few resources the federal government had in surplus that autumn was idle labor. Relief programs were paying men to build roads, drain swamps, and put up schools, and archaeology was one of the projects that qualified for that funding. Cole's task was to take a crew of unemployed men from the surrounding counties, hand them picks and shovels under professional direction, and find out what was buried under the ridge above Avery Lake. What the relief rolls made possible was the first serious look at something that had been sitting in plain sight the whole time. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What the ridge above Avery Lake actually held was a city. The people archaeology calls Mississippian arrived in the area around the year 1050 and stayed for roughly 350 years. At its height, the settlement carried at least 11 platform mounds, and by some estimates as many as 19, arranged around a central plaza and enclosed by a wooden palisade wall thick enough to have consumed entire stands of timber to build. The tallest platform rose some 15 feet above the plaza floor, built not from a natural clay deposit, but from thousands of individual basket loads of earth, carried and packed by hand, layer over layer, across generations. Structures once stood on top of them, temples, council houses, the residence of a chief whose position was inherited and whose authority, judging by the objects buried with the site's most prominent dead, carried a claim to something like divine sanction. Corn farmers in the surrounding bottomland, in small villages stretching from Hamletsburg to Brookport, fed the center with grain, and the whole arrangement functioned as what archaeologists call a chiefdom, a governed, unequal, agriculturally supported society, with the town now known as Kincaid sitting at its capital. The town's own history was not a straight line. Excavation showed that the very first mound built at Kincaid stood alone for a time, while a village occupied the ground around it, until a flood on the Ohio River, larger than any flood recorded since, rose high enough to bury that early village under a layer of gravel and white sand, and leave only the one mound standing clear of the water. What the survivors did next says more about the place than the flood itself does. Rather than rebuild where the water had reached, they cleared the old village away entirely and laid out a new plaza, raising the mounds that still stand today. A civilization drowned once, in other words, long before Cole ever set foot on the ridge, and what he eventually excavated was in part the second town its people built after the water pulled back. The region itself carries an old nickname that has nothing to do with the mounds and everything to do with how the ground behaves. Southern Illinois has long been called Little Egypt, for its fertile river bottoms and its habit of flooding the way the Nile once did, and it is a strange coincidence of language that the same corner of the country nicknamed for one ancient river civilization turned out to be sitting on top of another one entirely. What the excavators pulled out of the ground over that decade filled in some of what the mounds themselves could only imply. Shell ornaments traded up from the Gulf Coast, ceramic vessels painted in a distinctive negative resist style found nowhere outside a handful of Mississippian centers. Groundstone discs, used for a game called Chunky, played by throwing spears at a rolling stone target, a pastime that shows up in written accounts of Mississippian descendants centuries later. None of it, on its own, was spectacular. Together, it was the material signature of a society wealthy and organized enough to import goods from hundreds of miles away, and idle enough, at least some of the time, to play games on its own plaza. The scale invites comparison because Kincaid was not unique. 140 miles to the north and west sat Cahokia, the largest pre-contact city north of Mexico, a metropolis of 10 to 20,000 people at its peak, with its own great earthen pyramid, Monk's Mound, rising 100 feet above the floodplain of the Mississippi. Kincaid was smaller, and it flourished later than Cahokia's own peak, but the two sites shared a common language of earthwork construction and long-distance trade, connected to a wider network of Mississippian centers that archaeologists now call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, and both had been reduced, by the time European settlers reached the region, to unexplained hills that farmers ploughed around without asking why. What set Kincaid apart in the end was how completely the memory of what it had been drained out of the historical record before anyone thought to write it back in. Cole's crew worked the site from 1934 through 1944, a full decade, funded largely by federal relief money and staffed mostly by men whose primary qualification was that they needed the wages. The workforce, drawn from relief rolls across the surrounding counties, numbered in the hundreds over the years the project ran, far more manpower than any university archaeology department could otherwise have afforded. Under Cole's direction, and under the daily supervision of a rotating group of graduate students, they opened long trenches across the plaza and cut into the mounds themselves, reading the layers of soil and construction fill the way a geologist reads rock. Some of what they worked out on that ridge, the large-scale horizontal trenching, the careful stratigraphic mapping of a mound's building history, became standard practice across American archaeology in the decades that followed. Cole was training an entire generation at once. Several of the students who cut their teeth on those trenches, among them Joseph Caldwell and John Bennett, went on to careers that shaped how the whole discipline approached the eastern woodlands. But the student whose later work throws the longest shadow back onto Kincaid itself was Richard McNeish, who would go on, some 20 years later, to identify the wild ancestor of corn in a cave in Mexico's Tehuacan Valley. A researcher who learned his trade digging the mounds of Ohio River corn farmers spent much of the rest of his career chasing corn itself back to its point of origin, on a different continent, in a different valley, generations removed from the fields around Avery Lake. The results of that decade of digging were compiled and published in 1951 in a volume titled Kincaid, a Prehistoric Illinois Metropolis, credited to Cole and 7 of the researchers who had worked under him. It remains the foundational text on the site to this day. And then, following Cole's retirement in 1947 and the book's publication 4 years after that, Kincaid dropped almost entirely out of the front rank of American archaeology for the better part of 4 decades. The site sat there through those decades, unbothered and still visible from the county road, while prominent research in the field shifted toward the American Southwest and the deserts of Mexico. Nobody has ever pointed to a single dramatic reason for that fade. The plainest answer, that Cole retired and the university never assigned the project the same weight again, is also the least dramatic one, and it is very likely the true one. What is harder to account for cleanly is what happened to the material that decade of digging actually produced. The bones and artifacts recovered at Kincaid did not stay in southern Illinois. They went north, to the University of Chicago, where they joined a skeletal collection built up over decades from excavations at several Illinois mound sites, fissure and starved rock alongside Kincaid, a collection that grew through both formal fieldwork and private donation. The state of Illinois now maintains an office dedicated to reviewing and, where possible, returning ancestral remains and burial objects taken from Mississippian sites across the region, and one pattern that office has documented in the broader record is how often such material moved between institutions across the 20th century without a consistent paper trail, university to museum to private hands and back, with no clean line connecting an object in a drawer today to the specific mound it came out of 80 years earlier. Kincaid's human remains sit somewhere inside that larger, imperfect accounting. Exactly where and under what documentation is not a question the surviving record answers cleanly, and the state office charged with sorting it out is still, as of this year, doing that work. What survived that first decade of excavation was extraordinary by almost any measure, and it still left the site only partially examined. Cole's crews reached a fraction of Kincaid's mounds, and none of the surrounding farming villages under systematic study. When later researchers eventually returned to ask more precise questions, they would be working with ground the original crews had already disturbed, and records that, careful as they were for their era, could not answer questions nobody in 1934 had yet thought to ask. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Kincaid fits a pattern that shows up again and again across the Mississippian world, and the pattern is about timing more than concealment. At Cahokia, aerial photographs taken in the 1920s and again in the 1930s, the same decade Cole's crews were working the ridge above Avery Lake, showed faint linear streaks running through the fields near Monk's Mound, soil marks consistent with a buried wall. Archaeologists suspected what those marks meant almost as soon as the photographs came back from processing. It took until 1966, 3 decades later, for excavation to confirm it. A stockade wall, nearly 2 miles long, rebuilt at least 3 times over 2 centuries, once ringing the ceremonial heart of the largest city in pre-contact North America. 30 years passed between the shadow on the film and the proof in the ground, not because anyone buried the photograph in a drawer, but because confirming it required digging, and digging required a reason to prioritize that particular question over everything else competing for the same researchers and the same funding. 400 miles east, on the Ohio River near Evansville, Indiana, a nearly identical story unfolded on almost exactly the same timeline. Angel Mounds, another walled Mississippian town with its own earthen platforms, occupied from roughly 1100 to 1450, came under excavation starting in 1939, again funded by federal relief labor. 277 men worked the site between April of that year and May of 1942, local laborers who needed the wages considerably more than they cared about archaeology. Under the direction of archaeologist Glenn Black, the crews recovered more than 2 million artifacts, including a small human figure carved from yellow fluorite and buried at the summit of the site's temple mound. The volume of material was so large that cataloging and analysis continued for decades after the excavation itself wound down, and in some respects it continues still. Black himself never really left the site. He kept working and training students there long after the relief funding dried up, and between 1946 and 1962 he taught more than 100 of them, over a third of them women, at a field school that eventually became a permanent research laboratory bearing his name. Kincaid had no equivalent second act. Cole retired, the book came out, and the ridge above Avery Lake went quiet for 40 years in a way the banks of the Ohio near Evansville never quite did. 2 rivers, 2 Depression-era relief crews. 2 Mississippian capitals that almost nobody outside a narrow circle of specialists had previously taken seriously, both pulled into the light by the same federal jobs program within the same handful of years. What connects the 2 sites is simple timing, not hidden coordination. The emergency measures of one crisis intersecting with an entirely different kind of buried history, producing more evidence than the institutions receiving it could absorb in a single generation. Return to the ridge above Avery Lake as it stands today, and the picture is neither a tidy triumph of discovery nor a simple story of loss. Of the roughly 19 earthworks estimated to have existed at Kincaid's height, only 9 survive today as recognizable structures. 10 are gone, most of them worn down slowly across 2 centuries of farming, rather than lost in any single dramatic event, though at least one clear instance is on record. In the late 1960s, a farmer leveled a stretch of the Massac County bank above Avery Lake to open a new crop field, and archaeologists from Southern Illinois University could only manage a hurried salvage excavation before the ground went under cultivation. What they recovered from that rescue dig is now the only record of whatever had stood on that particular stretch of ridge. The state of Illinois purchased the Massac County core of the site in 1975, and Kincaid carries the designations that are supposed to guarantee protection. It has been a National Historic Landmark since 1964 and listed on the National Register of Historic Places since 1966. And yet in 2018, the statewide preservation group Landmarks Illinois placed Kincaid on its list of the state's most endangered historic places, citing soil erosion, inadequate funding, damaging farm practices on the surrounding private land, and the ongoing activity of unauthorized collectors walking the fields with shovels and metal detectors. That last threat is not abstract. Collectors from well outside the county still turn up at the site's public events with private collections built over lifetimes, men who describe finding their first artifact as children and never really stopping, working the same ground the state is trying to protect. The site has no full-time staff of its own. What oversight it gets comes from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and a small non-profit support organization that mows the mounds, maintains the interpretive signs, and opens the site to the public one day a year, on the fourth Saturday of October, when visitors are permitted to climb Mound 8 and look out over Avery Lake the same way Fay-Cooper Cole once did. Southern Illinois University resumed serious work at Kincaid in the years after 2003, using magnetometry and soil resistivity surveys that let researchers map what lies underground without disturbing it, tools Cole's crews with their picks and shovels never had. That newer work has already turned up structures the original decade of excavation missed entirely, including circular buildings far more common across the site than anyone had previously recognized, and a fuller outline of a palisade wall that was apparently rebuilt more than once as the town grew and its needs changed. Paul Welch, a retired anthropologist from Southern Illinois University Carbondale, who has spent decades studying the site, put it plainly to a small crowd gathered on Mound 8 at a recent field day. The site, he said, is more complex than anyone thought even 10 years earlier, and it keeps getting more complex the closer it is examined. Recent papers coming out of that renewed work carry titles like Mounds Lost and Found, a fair summary of the site's whole second century of study, which has spent as much effort locating what earlier decades quietly let go as it has spent finding anything new. One recent dissertation on the site is titled, simply, After Images of Kincaid Mounds, which is as good a description as any of what the current generation of researchers is actually working with. Not the city itself, but the traces the city left in soil, in bone, and in the gaps of an 80-year-old field notebook. Most days, the ridge above Avery Lake sits empty. A viewing deck looks out over the mounds from a respectful distance. The signs describe what stood where, and the site waits, the way it has waited through most of its history, for someone to pay it the attention Cole's crews once did, with their picks and their federal wages. On the one day it opens fully, the fourth Saturday of October, the crowd that climbs Mound 8 is a mix of state archaeologists, university researchers, and private collectors comparing notes on finds made decades apart, all of them standing on the same packed earth that a Mississippian chief's household once stood on, 900 years before any of them were born. What Fay-Cooper Cole found on that ridge in 1934 had never vanished the way a shipwreck sinks out of sight. It had stood in full view of every farmer who ploughed around it, a working society's capital, built over 3.5 centuries, drowned once by the river and rebuilt by its own people long before any American ever saw it, remembered in outline by the descendants of the builders, and left unexamined by the institutions that eventually claimed the authority to explain it, until an economic collapse put unemployed men to work with shovels because there was nothing else left to pay them to do. 60 years after Cole's crew packed up its equipment, the site is neither destroyed nor secure. It survives at 9 of its original 19 mounds. Its bones and burial goods sit somewhere inside a record system too large and too old to trace cleanly. Its remaining earthworks wear down a little further with each spring's ploughing, watched over one day a year by people who still climb the same rise Cole once stood on, and who still cannot say, with any certainty, who most of the men who dug there in 1934 actually were. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next one.